Right now, I think a lot of people are burnt out on space games. The reason isn't simply because space games are boring though, the reason is much deeper. Many of these games promise scowl, and instead deliver only emptiness. And what you end up getting is a huge map with long travel times and the general feeling that you're meant to be providing your own meaning to the game, because the game itself is just not offering you that. So then, this video is not about here are 5 more space games you need to play. Instead, it's 5 games that actually solve the thing space games keep failing at. Not with a bigger galaxy, and certainly not with more stuff, but rather, instead, with density. And more specifically, where distance creates choices, where the world pushes back, and more importantly, where being in space actually feels like something. All of this then is not just about a genre, rather it's about the difference between a world that is big and a world that is actually alive. A lot of space games treat scowl as how far apart things are, but that just creates downtime. What you actually want is scowl as pressure, scowl as trade-offs, and even sometimes a scowl as consequence. So that's the definition I'm using for the 5 games right here, the filter as it were, and you can see the filter on the screen right here. Does travel mean something, or is it just time? Does the game create friction and decisions minute to minute? Does the world have intention, systems, mystery or stakes so that it actually feels meaningful? Now, if you've been bouncing off the genre lately, these are the games that tend to break that spell. And on a quick note here, if this kind of why games feel the way they do breakdown is useful, please consider subscribing. Because I'm building a catalogue of videos here that are going to be less about hype and more about the underlying design problems and what actually fixes them. Also, all of these are currently discounted in the Steam sale, which is honestly the perfect time, the perfect moment to actually experiment without committing a huge amounts of cash or another 100-hour disappointment. Now, The Outer Worlds is one of those games that feels absolutely huge, but it's quite difficult to put your finger on precisely why that is. The thing is, Outer Worlds doesn't try to impress you with how far you can travel, but it does make space feel dense by making it purposeful. And this is perhaps the best example that I know of in a game where emptiness disappears because the world is built around questions. In this game, you're not setting out to grind and you're not farming, and you're certainly not following a quest marker because the UI told you to. What's happening instead is something very different, and really it's something much deeper. You're following your own curiosity, and the solar system around you is designed to reward that curiosity constantly. One of the things Outer Worlds gets right then, perhaps more so than any other space game, is the fact that meaning beats size. Every location in the game isn't just content, you'll find it's also a piece of a much larger structure, and it's here where the world feels like it was built by a mind, not just generated by a machine, not just generated by procedural generation. And because of that, even short trips actually feel loaded. And that means you're not travelling just to fill the time, you're actually travelling because you might learn something that changes everything. And The Outer Worlds really does show you what that feels like when it works. Because when it does work, you stop thinking, how big is this? And you start thinking, what is this place hiding? And that is precisely what I mean by the term density when it comes to these type of games. It's not about it being chock full of content, but it's rather about discoverability. Now you might be wondering who this game is for. Well, if you're tired of games that feel like sightseeing, and you want a space game that feels like discovery but with stakes, then this is the one that's going to be for you. The game then is a mystery, so go in blind as you can. The less spoilers you have about this, the better you're going to be. And yeah, there's also a mechanic in the game that does create a pressure on you, but that pressure is really a big part of why the game actually works. The Outer Worlds then proves my core point. Space doesn't need more stuff, it really just needs intention. Now, a lot of space games out there, a lot of games in general actually, fall into a very specific type of trap, and this is the trap I call the emptiness trap. So a lot of space games are mostly travel with occasional action sprinkled on top, but EVERSPACE 2 flips that on its head. Instead, it treats space like a sequence of spaces, design spaces where something is always trying to happen. And these things can vary. They might be a mystery, they might be some combat, they might be a discovery. Either way, they're going to be engaging. And the whole point here, the principle that EVERSPACE 2 gets right, is that friction creates presence, the very sensation that you feel like you're inside the universe. This is quite simply put because you're not waiting for the game to become interesting. You're also not flying in a straight line, hoping that something might interrupt you or that you might randomly come across something interesting. Instead, what's going on here is that you're constantly making small decisions, and these can include things such as positioning, selecting targets, choosing which resource to collect, or weighing up whether or not to take a specific risk. And that means even 10 minutes in, you feel like you've actually played something interesting. You're not wasting your time. You're feeling like every minute is actually valuable and well rewarded. So if you've found yourself somewhat burnt out on the genre, then this is very likely a game you're going to want to check out. And that is because it doesn't actually ask you to create your own excitement. And yes, there are places for that with some games, but with EVERSPACE 2, it's all created here for you if that's what you're looking for. In other words, it gives you a steady stream of problems to actually solve and to engage with. At this point, you're probably starting to notice the theme of this video, and it is, of course, the emptiness trap. And No Man's Sky avoids this one very, very well indeed, because it's a game that people think of when they think space exploration. But here's a bit of a thought on this one, and it's one that many people actually don't always consider. It's not so much that No Man's Sky actually solves the emptiness problem, at least not by jamming it full of content, although it does do that, and not by making the space necessarily more meaningful. Instead, what happens is that No Man's Sky gives you a rhythm. Yes, No Man's Sky is all about cadence, and here, cadence really does matter. It means that there's always a loop pulling you forward, whether that's the fact that you want to scan or upgrade, whether you want to build, jump, or maybe even go out and discover something, or just repeat the whole loop again. And the game is extremely good at making you feel like you're always nudging your situation forward, that there's always something to do, that there's always something over the next horizon or in the next star system. So even when the world is absolutely massive, you really don't feel isolated, stranded, or entirely alone, although of course you can. When you're on some of these isolated, desolated planets, it feels vast and you feel small. But even then, what happens is the game keeps presenting the small goals and the small rewards. In other words, the way I like to phrase this is that it's not about the density of the consequences the game offers, but rather it's about the density of momentum. And you'll see the evidence of this pretty much every time someone talks about No Man's Sky, because what you'll hear is that these people are constantly seeing something new. They're constantly tinkering with their ships, and the game is always offering another session, another reason to take just one more look, one more jump, and one more reason to load it up. So if you want space as a relaxing, creative loop, something to explore, a place to build, whether you want to collect or just wander, then this is still one of the best options out there. Again, I'll give another caveat here as I did with the previous game. This is not going to be suitable for everyone necessarily, because if what you crave is a universe that reacts strongly to your actions, to the politics, to your economy, to long-term consequences, then here No Man's Sky may feel a little bit on the thin side. It may feel a little bit shallow to you. But on the other hand, if you're burnt out on space games because you feel that nothing often happens, then No Man's Sky is basically designed from the ground up to make sure that something is always happening. Density of the moments in No Man's Sky then is all through cadence. It's a game that keeps you moving even when the universe itself is endless. Now, Jump Space, formerly known as Jump Ship, is another game that's really gone out of its way to solve the emptiness trap, and one thing you'll notice is that each of these games is doing it in a very different way. So a problem that many people have with space games is that they can be lonely. Often you're alone in a cockpit doing a lot of stretches of travel, and the universe itself can feel empty because you're the only moving part that actually matters. Jump Space solves that by making the ship a job. The content in the game here is the ship itself, but also the stuff that surrounds the ship. And this is where there's a very strong principle that this game gets very right indeed. Space becomes busy when you're a crew and not a tourist. And that means you've got roles here, someone piloting, someone managing systems, someone fighting fires, and there's someone there patching the holes in the ship when the ship starts falling apart. And that means that's something very specific for this game. It means that space stops being a backdrop. It's not just something that surrounds you, instead it's something far deeper. Here, it becomes an environment that constantly demands your attention. And this is something we don't see in a lot of other space games. It's a density of a very different kind. It's not 1,000 planets, it's just one ship that can become chaos in 30 seconds if you're not all coordinating together. And what this actually means, what it feels like, is that when you're out in jump space, when you've completed a session, or when you're back at base, you don't really remember the emptiness out there because you've been too busy keeping the situation from totally falling apart. And that totally changes the focus of this game compared to many other space games, because here it's not about travelling through space, at least that's not the exclusive focus. Instead, it's about operating in space. So if you've bounced off all those solo space games that are out there because, they feel a bit isolating, if that's kind of getting you down, then this is one that turns space into a bit of a social experiment, into a frantic problem-solving experience. But on the other hand, that's also a bit of a problem perhaps for some people, because this is a co-op first game, at least for now, until we see some future updates. For now, if you don't have people to play with, then the game is likely not going to feel the same. Although there are plans later to introduce AI crews, for now that's not there. But if you do like other players, if you do like co-op games, then this is one of the best examples of how you can make space feel dense without needing a massive universe. For me, perhaps one of the biggest problems when it comes to space games is the fact that so many games mistake scale for distance. That's not implicitly that there's anything wrong with distance, but that it's not always the best measure for what makes a good experience inside a game. X4 then is a game that tries a very different approach, and it's one of the few that actually tries to make scale mean interdependence. X4 then very much focuses on consequence. That is the density of space in this game. So X4 is built around a simulated economy. Ships and stations aren't just there floating in the background just for you to interact with from time to time. Instead, they exist inside supply chains. In X4, resources are fundamental. They really do matter, and without them, nothing else starts to move. Also, production is essential. Factions build over time, they expand, and they react not just to you, but to each other. And this theme is very much present when you hear people talk about X4. You rarely, if ever, actually hear X4 players say anything like, "I travelled for 10 minutes. Instead, what you hear is them saying things to the effect of, "I changed something in this universe." And maybe that's something small, maybe it's something big. It could be the fact they stabilised a shortage, or perhaps they disrupted a faction's ability to build ships, or even, sometimes, quite often in fact, you actually build something that shifts trade and conflict entirely. The outcome of the way all of this works and functions is that the map in X4 is not just something that's empty that needs to be explored, because it's not really just a map. It is instead something that's very much alive. It's a system that has interconnection and consequences. And what's more, you can interact with all of that yourself and directly influence it. And yeah, you can even make it your own. So X4 is pretty much unlike any other space game out there. It's a game that gives you a very rare sensation. It's something that space games promise but almost never actually deliver. With X4, scale really does matter. And it matters not because everything is far away, it matters because what's happening here is that everything in the game is connected. So, if you want a space game where choices actually have consequences, but they echo across the universe, whether that's down to economy or the amount of power accumulated, whether it's the relationship between factions or even a massive infrastructure, then this is perhaps the best example of a space game you can ever try. But that is also, likewise, the disclaimer for this title, because yes, it can be very intimidating. It's not the fastest game to pick up. It does have some problems with the UI being very complicated. It's not a pick up and play game by any means. But by that same token, if you've been craving a game and a universe that actually reacts to you, then X4 is one of the best answers out there. So that's the list. It's not about the biggest space games as you've probably seen. I'm not showing you the prettiest space games either. What we've got here is 5 games that dodge the emptiness trap in 5 different ways. In turn, they've got meaning, friction, cadence, teamwork, and consequence. And yes, because it's the Steam sale, this means it's the perfect time to try one of these without feeling like you've wasted a ton of money on a game that's overpromising. Also, if you want the deeper breakdown of why space games often feel so empty and what Scowl actually needs to do to feel meaningful, then watch my video on Space Scowl next. I'll link that at the end of this video. That video is basically the underlying argument that connects everything you just saw here today. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments section which kind of density you want more of, whether that's meaning, systems, teamwork, or pure moment-to-moment friction, because your comments will definitely have an impact on what video I plan next.